BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, it's Anna Hill here with the Farming Today podcast, where we hear why some dairy farmers are getting out of the industry, how the Welsh budget is stacking up for farmers there, and what Donald Trump's plans for trade could mean for UK farmers. First, though, all week we're taking a look at the dairy industry. While milk production has been maintained across the UK, the number of individual dairy farms has fallen.
We stood in our cow shed. We invested in this about 5 years ago. There's about 120 cows in here. They've just finished milking. These cows have been with us and in my history for 100 years. It's very much a part of who I am.
What's it like, though, being a dairy farmer in this day and age?
It seems to get more and more complicated every year, and there's increasing demands of what dairy farmers have to do. There's research all the time about how we can make these cows be fitter and healthier, and we need to make sure we keep up with all of this research. And it's just about invest.
What do you find are the biggest challenges on a day-to-day basis?
Really, it's trying to deal with this ever-increasing legislation. It's not just a case of you feed the cow, you get the milk and you sell the milk. It's, gosh, I now need to do this and this and this, and it's going to cost me this much money this year, and how do I afford that? And yeah, it's massive challenges.
And for more traditional family farms like yours has been, how do they fare when they're trying to get the milking contracts compared to maybe bigger farms?
So milk contracts are largely dictated, they're usually dictated by your postcode. If you live close to a motorway, you're likely to supply what we call a liquid milk market. It will go into your bottles. If you live a long way from those chimney pots, then you're probably going to supply the cheese market, which will be lower volumes of milk. And for small farms and farms that live out of the way, it is really challenging to get these contracts now.
Well, joining me here at Abby's farm is Jonathan Wilkinson, who is the chairman of the NFU Dairy Board here in Wales. Jonathan, what's the situation for dairy farmers at the moment?
I feel that dairy farming in Wales and in the UK is in a state of flux. We're looking at around about one dairy farm a week since COVID exiting the industry. We saw significant milk price change at that time, and because of the marginal nature of what we do, farmers haven't been able to absorb that degree of volatility.
Here in Wales, though, more dairy farmers are leaving the industry than elsewhere in the UK. What's specific about Wales and why people are finding it so tough?
Government policy in Wales since devolution has diverged somewhat from what's been happening in, for example, England. So we have specific policies around TB and animal disease, for one. The nitrogen vulnerable zone. The All Wales MVZ area came as quite a shock, I think, for most farmers, and the stringent water quality regulation in many cases requiring significant investment. So you've got two examples there of things that are specific to Wales. Having said that, I meet ambitious young farmers every day. So I think the future is bright, providing that they're provided with that certainty.
So Abby, could you ever see a time when you stop being a dairy farmer?
No, personally no. This is totally ingrained in everything that I do. So this is about making sure I box clever now to make sure it survives.
Well, Abby, we've just walked into your polytunnel, which is not what you expect on a dairy farm.
No, it's really not. So we've just finished growing a round of tomatoes and cucumbers. There's still some things growing in the tunnel. The aubergines have just come to an end, and we've got a few Brussels sprouts on the go. I'm conscious that a lot of people are losing confidence in the dairy industry, and trying to attract new people in is difficult. So I'm hoping that maybe by offering different jobs on the farm as well as cows, that will attract more people here. And again, it would hopefully just add to that income stream and be able to support more people who work here.
Abby Reader, Deputy President at NFU Cymru, and we'll come back to Wales at the end of the programme. While Donald Trump doesn't take up his presidential role until January the 20th next year, he's already indicated clearly his approach to trade, and it'll mean high tariffs on imports into the US. Mr. Trump has chosen Brooke Rollins, president of the America First Policy Institute, to be Agriculture Secretary. He said she will spearhead the effort to protect American farmers who are truly the backbone of our country. At the same time, the UK government says it wants to reset our trading relationship with the European Union. There are questions over whether the war in Ukraine will be resolved, and massive disruption in the Middle East and in South Korea are all playing into a challenging time for trade. So how will the UK's food producers be affected, and how do we make ourselves competitive in such a disrupted global market? I asked Kev Bevan, an independent agricultural economist, what the plan for US tariffs might mean for UK farmers.
Well, potentially, as we saw in the previous Trump government, tariffs on whiskey, did cause problems. You would have to say, though, that from a UK viewpoint, we're obviously a substantial net importer of product. So we're probably not in the crosshairs like Mexico and China and indeed the EU. So those are probably the countries and regions most concerned about potential tariffs. But for specific parts of the UK economy, it will be a concern.
What about currency? The strong dollar, would that make imports of things like fertiliser more expensive?
Yeah, that's a concern, is that, of course, now that we're not producing any nitrogen fertiliser of our own, that is a concern. A strong US dollar will make inputs more expensive. A lot of global commodities as well are priced in American dollars, so that also has an impact.
Could a trade war with China have an impact, do you think? For instance, if things change and Australia and New Zealand, who send sheep meat to China, might not do that and send it to the UK instead?
I think the concern is if the world is under American pressure, splitting into a kind of China-US split. Countries like Australia and New Zealand come into the US camp, then it'll be interesting to see how the Chinese potentially react to that.
I just want to move on to the UK and the EU. We've had recent meetings, haven't we, between the UK and the EU on trade. Could we see a more fluid trade agreement? Do you think that there's room there for manoeuvre?
Yes, I don't think it'll be so much, obviously not a renegotiation, but there's the opportunity that everybody talks about is signing a veterinary agreement, which would reduce the paperwork significantly, because there would be acceptance that our standards were as good as EU standards. But again, if you do that, and why the previous UK government didn't want to do that, was it reduces your opportunities to negotiate trade agreements with non-EU countries. The new UK government has been very careful not to overpromise and get too excited about new trade arrangements, because obviously it's got to balance trade with other countries as well or potential trade agreements.
What should British farmers be thinking about in relation to trade for next year?
Whatever happens on the international front, what we can work on is improving our productivity and competitiveness. With basic payment scheme being phased out in England, then that competitiveness is being driven by that probably more than potential trade issues. The things to concentrate on is effectively how productive we can be at farm level. So concentrating on what we can do is probably more important than being too concerned with potentially what might come as a result of President Trump upsetting international trade.
Agricultural economist Kev Bevan. Last month, thousands of farmers rallied in Whitehall in London in protest at the budget decision to introduce inheritance tax for farm assets over £1 million. Well, despite talk since then, there's been no movement from the government on that tax. DEFRA has announced this morning that a new Countryside Stewardship Higher Tier scheme will open next year with quarterly payments and a rolling application window. There are also new schemes for flood resilience, species abundance and sites of special scientific interest. But many farmers are still angry about the inheritance tax, and to continue their protest, they're staging a tractor rally today in London. Since the budget, there have been local protests too. In Melton Mowbray, a rally was held on Monday by the newly formed Midlands Farmers Group. BBC East Midlands reporter Emily Anderson was there.
There's a real sense of defiance here in Melton. The newly formed Midlands Farmers Group are staging this protest in the town centre because they want to protect an industry which they say is currently on its knees. Local farmer Simon Orson founded the group.
End of the day, Melton Mowbray is steeped in farming history. A lot of the businesses that are here rely on farming, and so therefore we had to have a protest here. It's a lack of support for farming. All we're trying to do is grow food for people, and the government just doesn't seem to be interested.
The government says around 500 estates a year are expected to pay inheritance tax from April 2026. But campaigners say up to 75,000 of the UK's farms could be affected. Ben Barnes is an arable and sheep farmer in Somerby near Melton.
It's the most uncertain it's ever been. Unprecedented times. The loss of the single farm payment, which is the subsidy we used to get. We no longer have that.
The Midlands Farmers Group say they plan to ramp up their campaign after Christmas if the government don't listen to their concerns.
Emily Anderson reporting, and we'll bring you news from the London Tractor Rally in tomorrow's programme. Well, the Welsh budget is top of farmers' minds there, as it was delivered to the Senedd yesterday. It's a marked contrast to the budgets of recent years, which had brought cuts to spending on rural affairs. Westminster has given Wales a £1 billion cash boost, which the Welsh Finance Secretary Mark Drakeford said now puts Wales in a different world.
It is a budget for growth, and it is a budget which reminds people in Wales why time after time they have put their faith in a Labour government.
Well, with more details, here's BBC Wales Environment correspondent Stefan Messenger.
Farming leaders were watching closely as Mark Drakeford addressed the Senedd, delivering a budget he said would provide optimism for the first time in a while. Recent years have seen spending cuts to most government departments in a bid to shore up the NHS. Having two Labour governments at either end of the M4 meant there was an opportunity now to turn a corner, Mr Drakeford claimed. Most of the Welsh Government's funding comes from Westminster, with an extra £1 billion handed over in the Chancellor's budget in October. It means that this time around all departments see an increase in the money available to them on top of a £600 million boost for the health service. There's a 6.6% increase in revenue and a 31% increase in capital funding for climate change and rural affairs. The government says it's prioritising support for agriculture by maintaining the budget for the main farm subsidy, the basic payment scheme, at £238 million next year, with an uplift too in the funding available for wider rural investment schemes. The Farmers' Union of Wales welcomed the announcement, but said urgent questions remained over how this compared with pre-Brexit funding levels and how the department's spending would support family farms and the wider rural community. The Welsh Conservatives said funding increases by Labour ministers in Wales came on the back of tax hikes and a maxed-out government credit card from the new Chancellor in Westminster, all while pensioners were losing vital benefits and farmers forced to break up family farms, they added. Plaid Cymru described the budget as wholly underwhelming, claiming it fell well short of what's needed to allow farmers to deliver on the demands being placed upon them by the government. Elsewhere in the budget, the embattled environmental regulator Natural Resources Wales, which has recently confirmed it's closing 233 posts as part of a cost-saving restructure, welcomed increased funding of just over £15 million. And there's £1.6 million set aside for work on developing plans for a new national park in north-east Wales. A public consultation on the proposals is set to close next week, with the government set to make a decision on whether to plough ahead before the next Senedd election in 2026.
BBC Wales Environment correspondent Stefan Messenger. That's all from us. I'm Anna Hill. The producer was Rebecca Rooney. Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.